Today's guest is Nick Dirks, the author of the new book, City of Intellect, The Uses and Abuses of the University. He previously served as the 10th Chancellor of UC Berkeley until mid-2017. Nick is the president and CEO of the New York Academy of Sciences and is a renowned scholar of South Asia. Before Berkeley, he held prominent academic and administrative roles at Columbia University in New York City. Thank you, Nick, for joining us today.
Great to be here with you, Jesse.
So as a chancellor of UC Berkeley from 2012 to about mid-2017, can you actually explain what the role of a university chancellor entails? I think when people hear chancellor, it's basically like the university president, right? But I think for people, they really might not have a clear idea what that is.
Yeah, when I told my mother I had become a chancellor, she thought I had moved to Germany. So, it's a title that isn't used all that much. But in the case of the University of California, each campus has a chancellor, and the chancellor is effectively the president of the university. But there is a president of the whole system, and because the president of the system is called a president, they use the term chancellor to be specific to each campus. And of course, in the history of the University of California, Berkeley was the only campus for many, many years. So the president of Berkeley was also the president, as it were, of the University of California. And as the University of California system grew, first with UCLA and now with 10 different campuses, they needed to set up somebody who was effectively the local president in each place. But I guess the other point to make for listeners is that in a system that is as big as California, where you have 10 different campuses, actually when you're chancellor, you're in charge of everything in the local university, but you also have a prominent kind of role in the politics of the state. And sometimes that is helped by a good relationship with the president of the system, and sometimes it can get complicated because you're in the world of politics. So it's president of a campus and a kind of political position too. But just, again, Texas has a chancellor who's head of the system, presidents of each campus. Terms are often used interchangeably.
And how much power or authority does the chancellor actually have? In reading your book, like you said, you have the president over the whole UC system. And I would imagine this is probably typical. Like, I'm from Wisconsin, so you got numerous universities. Probably Madison, and I went to UWM, and then you talked about how there's the university senate. And then if you have deans and other high-ranking faculty members that I guess you'd oversee, but you also have like different boards and stuff. So are you able to make a lot of decisions with your own autonomy, or are you kind of beholden to a lot of other, basically, where are you in that hierarchy, I guess would be the question.
Yeah, well, the simple answer is that the chancellor is the decider of last resort for each campus. So I was at the top of the deans and the faculty and other groups at the University of California, Berkeley. But, simple answers are usually not completely true. And that certainly is not a completely true statement, because there was a lot of shared governance that took place. In the first instance, there was shared governance with the faculty, and the faculty was represented by the Senate. In fact, the Senate had a lot of authority at a place like Berkeley and at a place like UW-Madison as well. Many public universities have very active faculty senates. At Berkeley, Senate committees even do things like assign salaries to faculty, which is something that I did as a dean at Columbia when I was there. So faculty have a lot of authority and some power. But the other thing about a system, and this is also true in Wisconsin and Texas and North Carolina, a lot of other places, when you have the head of a system, there can be, greater or lesser autonomy for each campus, depending in part on the way the system works and in part on the predispositions of the actual president of the system or the head of the system. And in the case of my time in California, I was hired by Mark Yudof, who was an academic leader, but he stepped down very shortly after I got there. And he was replaced by Janet Napolitano, who had been Secretary of Homeland Security and before that a governor of Arizona. And she had a very activist, shall I say, gubernatorial idea of how a president of a system would work. So she was less interested in the autonomy, for example, of each campus than her predecessor and also her successor. So these things also change because of the personality and particular position of the person in that role.
In reading your book, it seemed like when you're at least at Berkeley that the Senate had quite a bit of power, and I was thinking it's represented by the faculty. And as you kind of talked about how as universities, as the U.S. changes or any country changes over time, the needs of the university need to change as well to probably meet the changing needs of society at large. But then if you have these entrenched professors where it's like, if you're head of a department, you don't want your department to be consolidated into another department. You basically want the status quo because you are going to lose out on it, whether that's with prestige or finances, whatever. And so, I mean, maybe it's a crude analogy, but it's like, or you kind of have like the inmates running the prison or the asylum, whatever. I almost felt like the faculty, they have such conflicts of interest. Maybe they should have maybe a lesser role.
Well, I spent most of my academic career as a faculty member, and I believe that it's important for faculty to get involved in the governance of the university. So my first response is that, it's good to have faculty involved, and it's good to have them really talking all the time with the administration, and a breakdown of communication between faculty and the administration can be deadly for even the administrative authority to do things that are necessary for the university. But, there's a difference between having authority and having responsibility. And what often would happen is that faculty would advocate for certain kinds of things, but never have to do the bottom line, never actually have to do the P&L for the university. So they would say, give more money here, give more money there, give more money to all the things I care about, and don't cut here and don't cut there because that's going to cut into my, whatever, local base, my comfort level in terms of where I was initially hired. And they can be very resistant to change. And as you just said in the question you asked, there can be a lot of entrenched reasons for why it is that you want to maintain the status quo. So the experience I had at Berkeley was during a time when there was a big financial crisis. We found that shortly after I got there, we had a major structural deficit, and we had to make some serious cuts. And the faculty at Berkeley had been used to cuts because Berkeley has gone in and out of financial crisis over the years. But the only way to make those cuts successfully would be simply to have everybody, sort of pull their belt in and take a certain percentage that was equal. And I thought it might be a good idea to actually say, well, look, we have these problems. We need to do some structural change in order to become more resilient, to not only deal with the immediate financial crisis, but to anticipate future ones coming on down the line. And the institution changes very slowly. Maybe as a faculty, as an administration, we could actually make some big changes. In some instances, amalgamate departments, certainly in terms of administrative services. In other cases, create new cross-disciplinary collaborative efforts like the one I was doing in data science. And, across the board, think about how to be a little more efficient, but also a little more relevant to the changing conditions of the 21st century. And what I set in motion was this kind of real strong immune reaction on the part of the faculty, which is, a foreign agent is trying to change us, and we have to expel that foreign agent because we don't know what it's going to do. We don't know where it's going to infect a cell and what's going to be left after the process of change. So it's just a lot of uncertainty, a lot of worry about change, a lot of anxiety. And I had come in from the outside. I'd come in from a private university. I'd been at Columbia. And I think people initially were just very concerned about who was going to be making decisions about their lives, their place. Many faculty work in a single university, and certainly at Berkeley for 30, 40 years. So they see administrators coming and going, but they're going to stick around. So that was why I came to believe that the faculty need to take more responsibility for things like budgetary crises. And they also have to recognize that, in particular, tenured faculty are in an enormously privileged position. They have these lifetime jobs, which are very sweet, and they're very concerned about maintaining their privileges of different kinds, including, of course, tenure. And I get that. I was there. But, the way in which then you balance the budget if they don't get involved is you have to hire more adjuncts, and then you get faculty complaining about the adjunctification of the faculty, the kind of cost cuts and cost saving ways in which administrators try to make ends meet, instead of actually joining in the effort to figure out how we could perhaps better engineer the university so that you wouldn't have to hire people in that kind of way and share the burdens and responsibilities as also the privileges and and resources.
Kind of speaking of finances, you mentioned, the cost curve in your book. And do you know who Dr. Marion Nestle is?
No.
She's like a prominent nutritionist. She wrote books. Her most famous book is called like Food Politics. I think she teaches that, or she taught at NYU for years, but she worked in Congress. She's like a pretty prominent person. I had her on the podcast a while back, and I believe she's in her 80s, but she went to UC Berkeley, she said, in 1954. And we were kind of talking about cost of living and things like that. But she said in 1954, tuition was $32 at UC Berkeley, that she lived in a student co-op and paid $45 a month. And she said that for the whole year, between tuition, books, everything, and then her food, rent, just basic necessities, that she spent $900. And so I did a little, what is $900 in 1954 to 2024? And it turns out it's right around $10,200. You couldn't even rent a place in UC Berkeley in 2024 for $10,000, let alone have your tuition, your books, your food, everything. How did it go in 1954 when Dr. Marion Nestle was paying less than $1,000 to now it's university costs have just exploded? Like what's happened, I guess, between 54 and now?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I will say that I was asked a similar kind of question on a regular basis by Jerry Brown, who was governor of the state of California. He went to Berkeley in the 60s. And he said when he went, the fees and tuition were about $75 a semester. So they'd gone up from 54, but they weren't, they didn't go up very much. So one of the major and immediate differences between the 50s and 60s on the one side and the present is that the state paid a much higher percentage of the university budget. So back in those days, the state of California paid for about 75%, 80% of the university budget. When I got to Berkeley in 2012, the state paid only 12% of our overall budget. So really, it's been a case of steady erosion of state investment. And, everybody has seen this happen in state after state where there's less spent on education, more spent on healthcare, more spent on prisons. There are lots of demands on state coffers, to be sure, but there's simply not the level of expenditure for education, and particularly for higher education. So when I got to Berkeley in 2012, the tuition for an in-state student was somewhere between $12,000 and $13,000. Now, I thought that was pretty good because I came from Columbia, where it was closer to $45,000. And there were resources for financial aid, and a third to a half of students, in fact, got significant financial aid. But what you talked about just now is completely right. Berkeley's become increasingly expensive, hard to rent a room in a co-op for under, $10,000 a year or whatever. Then you add tuition, even if you're an in-state student, cost of living more generally, food, etc. It becomes, depending on, what your particular arrangement is, something per year of, $30,000, $35,000, even for an in-state student. And even if you're living pretty frugally. So that's a lot of money. Now, it's less than at Columbia, where the cost of education is at least double that, if not even higher. But it's a problem of cost across the board, both in private and public universities. One of the great things about Berkeley and University of Wisconsin, University of North Carolina, these are great universities. They have great faculty, they have amazing research, and they have been, in some fundamental way, a source of great pride in these states. And one of the ways in which, really good talent both is attracted to the state and then encouraged to stay, because many times you graduate from college in a place like, Chapel Hill or Berkeley or Madison, and you want to stay there. Great places, a lot of innovation going on in the economy, a lot of cultural resources, and so on. But these same places, and in particular California and New York, Boston, all of coastal California, have just become so expensive that when you add to that the costs of tuition and higher education, you just have what we see now. An explosive student debt issue. It was 2011, I think, that the amount of student debt in the U.S. went over $1 trillion. It's now closer to $2 trillion. And, that level of debt is keeping young people from doing the jobs they want to do, buying houses at an earlier stage, having families, a lot of things that I think in the 50s, 60s, and even 70s, people used to take for granted once they went to college and did not graduate with these levels of debt. So this is huge, huge, hugely important as an issue. So how do you bring it down? How do you bring that cost curve down? How do you actually begin to control costs and not just complain about the fact that the state isn't giving you enough money? And of course, the university, like the healthcare system, is predicated on, getting really talented people as doctors, surgeons, whatever on the one side, as professors, researchers on the other, to come to your place as opposed to someplace else. And you're competing in a marketplace. And at Berkeley, we were competing for faculty with Harvard and MIT and Stanford, all of which had more resources. But we nevertheless had to come close to meeting offers from the outside if we were going to have the top faculty. And we, of course, had great students. So we had to keep providing additional student services. And we felt the need to compete with other colleges and universities across the board in all kinds of ways. And yes, what that did is it drove up our expenses, which drove up the costs for students. And it's led to a kind of spiraling competitive marketplace in which we have this, huge problem of debt.
So you said that California was basically funding 75% of costs, and then now it's 12%. So did they just cut the total? Like, what did they do, I guess, with that money? Did they then give it to other programs, or was it just they had less overall money? 75 to 12% is a massive cut. It's not like you're talking 75 to even 50%. You're talking a tenth,
Yeah. Yeah, well, even between 2004, when my predecessor took office, in 2012, when I arrived, the percentage went down from around 35% to 12%. So there's a big drop. And of course, the big drop happened at the time of the major financial crisis of 2008, 2009. Before that, there'd been a kind of steady attenuation of support. And especially in the 70s, late 60s, 70s, Ronald Reagan became the governor of California, actually became the governor of California in part by campaigning to clean up the mess at Berkeley. But that also was part of his interest in, to some extent, privatizing the university, at least providing less in the way of public support for a university that he felt was, full of radical left-wing crazies. And yet he continued to support, the university in a way that by present-day standards would seem very generous. But, then there were financial crises in the 70s around the price of oil and so on. 80s was a long period of economic stagnation. And then what happened in the 90s when the economy began to rebound during a kind of neoliberal regime in which there was the opportunity for certain people to become much wealthier, but others, of course, not to benefit from that. You had universities which were, raising more money, but using that money often to, again, become more competitive in the kind of rat race that went on. So that just kept driving costs up instead of controlling them. But, during that whole process, again, the state just would give proportionally less and less and less money. In 2008, 2009, what happened is there was a massive cut. And it was replaced by raising tuition, effectively doubling the level of tuition. And in the short term, that compensated for the drop. But then when the state of California got money back in the coffers in around 2012, 2013, you had Jerry Brown as a governor. He believed in austerity. He actually wanted to put pressure on the university to cut our costs. And when I went and said, but we can't be competitive, he said, well, maybe you don't need to be competitive. Maybe you need to think about this as, government service, public service. Maybe nobody in the university should make more than what I make as governor of the state of California. But we had, doctors, legal professors, economists, computer scientists, all of whom could make much, much more money outside the university, who simply demanded a certain kind of competitive, compensation package. And I think, we could only have done what Jerry Brown wanted if we were willing to kind of take a free fall in terms of our quality. But it's that tension between, research excellence, educational excellence, and cost that we haven't been very good at navigating, negotiating, or coming up with good solutions for.
Yeah, you talk a little bit about sports in your or college sports in your book. I'm going to read this quote from your book. You say that universities seek to cater to the concerns of alumni and the larger public through major investments in intercollegiate athletics, an industry that has increasingly betrayed the rhetoric of student athletes, in quotes, in favor of professional entertainment, too often fundamentally at odds with the stated aims of serious education. And now with the whole, like, in college sport or in NCAA, we've had NIL since 2021, where basically these college athletes can make money off their name, image, likeness, get endorsements, etc. And I believe in 2023, there were 16 college football players that made more money than Brock Purdy, who was the starting quarterback in the Super Bowl for the San Francisco 49ers against Patrick Mahomes and the Chiefs. And then they just had the settlement basically saying, I think it's going to be the start of the 2025-2026 season, where now colleges can directly pay athletes. I think each team or something is going to have around $20 million budget. And then which leads to the question of, well, if you're paying these athletes, are they then employees? And so but you mentioned athletes in sports several times trying to make alumni happy. How does this this has to be the first, there's no longer amateurism anymore. How does this factor into the whole university system, cost curve, and everything?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I did write that, and I did worry a lot about intercollegiate athletics and what was going on as a part of that whole preoccupation at Berkeley, but of course even more so in some other universities that have been more successful in both football and basketball than Berkeley. But Berkeley does claim, for itself that it has as many, top athletes, for example, in the NFL coming off its football program as some of the other programs that are much better known, like Alabama or Auburn or Clemson or whatever. But it did lead to major issues. And major issues for me personally when I got there to be chancellor. For example, I arrived only to find a few months after I got there that the graduation rate of the football team had gone below 50%. And this was kind of a scandal because that really did underscore that worry that we were bringing athletes into the university who weren't students. If they weren't graduating anywhere close to the same rate as other students, then how could you say that either you were supporting them as real students or that that's what they really were in terms of why they came and how they did and so on. And we did have a few people who came for a year and left. Jaylen Brown, if you follow basketball, he played a big role in the Celtics victory this year. He was a great student, but he had money dangled in front of him and a career that was clearly promising, and he left. But the thing is this: in terms of revenue, in terms of finances, football does bring in money. Men's basketball brings in money. Increasingly, women's basketball is popular, but it hadn't been for a long time, and Caitlin Clark has done a lot to advance the cause of college women's basketball. But at Berkeley, we had 30 teams. In fact, we had 31 teams about a year into my time there because we added one. And most of them made no money at all. So what turned out to be the case was that we used our television contracts and our gate sales for, our ticket sales for football and to some extent basketball to try to fund the entire athletic program. If you took, for example, USC, UCLA, Berkeley, and Stanford, you get a picture where about 2/3 of America's Olympic athletes have been trained, in gymnastics and track and field and just about every swimming, et cetera. But there's no money behind it. There's no, the government doesn't support Olympic athletic training here as the government does in other parts of the world, famously in China and Russia, but elsewhere as well. So we had to do it. And so we were very keen to have both good television contracts, good apparel contracts with, whether it was with Nike or Under Armour or whoever. We wanted to bring in as much money as we could. But you see, what that then did is it drove up the sense that, that these athletes were generating huge revenue for the university, even if in fact it was being, used to cross-subsidize other sports and other athletes who couldn't generate any revenue whatsoever for, nobody would go to watch our swimming. I mean, very few went to watch swimming meets or track and field. It just wasn't, and if they did, they weren't paying anything to go. So So it became something that, we clearly were concerned to monetize, but again, for local circumstances. But, it still meant that you were putting a lot of resources into those sports. And we had coaches who were trying to recruit the best athletes. They always paid lip service to the fact that they were also interested in the students, but they weren't recruiting them because they were great at theoretical physics. They were hoping that they would be able to pass their courses and hopefully do well in them. But they were looking for left tackle to protect the quarterback that they had just recruited. So it became a kind of vicious circle. And what I saw when I went there, and I went from Columbia, which is in the Ivy League, which is Division I, but clearly not anywhere close to what the Pac-12, the old Pac-12 that now has gone by the wayside, but what the Pac-12 was, leave alone some of the other major conferences. And, I could be faulted for saying I didn't care that much about athletics because Columbia never won a football game. And in fact, the year before I went to Berkeley, Columbia was 0-1, 0-11, so I was kidded about that. But, again, the question is what are your priorities? And what I very quickly found was that the athletic budget wasn't, in fact, totally paid for, that the university had to subsidize the athletic program. And if you're putting, millions of dollars into an athletic program because you have to have all these different sports, but you also have sports like football and men's basketball in which the athletes are not always being recruited as much because of their student, interests as because of their athletic prowess, you begin to wonder, are you maintaining the real mission of the university, which is why I call my book The City of Intellect, which is what it was supposed to be. And what I fear we often lose sight of when we start adding all these different activities and services and interests into the mix of what makes for a university today. Now, last thing I'll say, but clearly alumni love to have a winning football team. They love to have a winning basketball team. And I get that. I taught for years at the University of Michigan. I was there when the Fab Five was there. It was exciting. But when you have a financial crisis in the university and you're subsidizing an intercollegiate athletic program, and then you find that what is really happening is that you're bringing in revenue that is ultimately going to be used to pay athletes who are going to be pre-professionalized at the beginning of their time in college, maybe you should take another look at it.
Yeah, in the book, and when you were just talking about when the governor was asking you basically to take a pay cut, whatever, it's like if you look at almost any state that at least has a big public university, the highest paid state employee is usually the football coach. They're making more money than the highest paid doctor at the university or the chancellor, deans, whatever, right? I mean, now he's like, it always makes you wonder where our priorities really lie in in society.
Yeah, no, I noticed that. I noticed when I negotiated a contract for a football coach that was, sort of 6x what I was making. But, that's symbolic of where, of where we invest importance. And, I love college football. I love college basketball. I don't want to come across as being a naysayer, but I do think we have to look at these things seriously.
Since we talked about the cost curve, one of the issues that a lot of people have nowadays is, like, back when I was using the example of Dr. Marian Nessel, where she, was paying $32 a semester. If you want to go be an art history major or a music major or study, Latin history in the 13th century, whatever, you're basically going to graduate with very little debt or maybe no debt. But nowadays, if you're getting that same degree, you're going to have, depending on what university, you're going to have maybe $100,000 in debt, which basically means you really need to go to university and pick a major that you're going to be able to make money to repay that student debt. I mean, you don't want to be a server when you're 40 years old with $80,000 in student debt. And you kind of talk in the book where you have to match what jobs that people can do. Like, college needs to train people, not just give them broad education, but where they can graduate and have jobs. And at least to me, I know so many people that have, I'm 42, and I have a master's degree, which I could probably say I've never, probably has actually hurt me for the jobs I've applied for. They think you're too smart. They're like, oh, you're not going to stick around. I've actually had to take it off my resume oftentimes and apply for jobs. And I would say of all the schooling I went to, I'd say the graduate program was actually by far the most educational and really made you think. I had a professor that's like, everything you've learned before this, unlearn it. You're here to think differently. You're here to research and not just like come up with your own theories instead of parroting a theory. So I really enjoyed that, but it's like then I can't even use it. And I feel like this is a very, unless you're like an engineer or computer science, which I think there's probably too many coders now, maybe that's swinging back around. And so I have my undergrad was in exercise science. So I actually had a lot of my classmates would go back to school for 2 years to be a nurse, because you're like, well, I can, some of the gen eds will cross over, so I can kind of knock out the nursing degree in like a year. Or others would go higher up and they would go to school to be a PA or physician's assistant, since there's a lot of crossover. But the thing, if you could at least do that with the degree that I had, but if you had all these other degrees where they're like, follow your passion, you're 18 years old making this decision, I think that to me is, I think the university and maybe high school counselors and things like that do a bad job of steering people into majors that they'll end up regretting.
Yeah, look, it's a complicated set of issues, because on the one hand, you want to have all students be able to do what, we tell them to do, and we give commencement speeches, which is to follow their passion and do the things they really care about, and do them now because you won't have a chance to do them later, and, all of that. And then, of course, you're right. I mean, a lot of students graduate from college and find that, the English degree that they did because they had a lot of passion, for Melville and Hawthorne and whoever, doesn't translate into a degree in Google or in Microsoft. And I'll just say a few things about this. One is that, if you go to a top school, it matters a little bit less what you major in. It still matters, but it matters a little less because you have the imprimatur of that school. And a lot of employers look at that. They'll look, you said your master's degree kind of, was a problem, but, you go to University of Wisconsin and, everybody knows it's the flagship, right? So, it does help. But on the other hand, you see your fellow students who majored in computer science lining up for interviews well before commencement day, because they can basically have whatever job they want at that point. There's, a few years ago, if you knew how to code and were, pretty good at a couple of different languages, computer languages, you wouldn't have trouble finding a job. Now, of course, the problem with that is that the world of technology changes. Increasingly, we know that generative AI is going to be doing some of the basic coding that is now done by people. It's certainly going to be acting as a co-pilot for people, and thereby potentially restricting the number of people who are going to actually get good jobs on the basis solely of knowing how to code. And increasingly, you want people who both understand algorithms, but also have some sense of what the impact of algorithms, say, are going to be on society. And then all of a sudden you begin to be able to make an argument for a more general education because, of course, OpenAI is interested in people who know about coding, but they're also interested in people who know about ethics. They're also interested in people who know about social and cultural world because of the impact AI is having, because of the kinds of worries that are out there. And then you need people with political government background because of issues of governance, and increasingly legal, technical issues because of the kinds of concerns around regulatory provisions related to AI. So in an odd way, we're coming back to a more liberal arts kind of curriculum when it comes to the skill set you need. But you still, if you're looking at a guaranteed job, and if you're looking at the amount of debt that is accumulated along the way, there's a kind of mismatch that, that people are obviously seeing and being disturbed by, and then making very conservative choices with respect to, even if those choices tend to be more short-term than long-term, because long-term, we don't even know what the impact of AI is going to be in terms of the careers that are out there, the kinds of jobs and the kinds of skills and expertise you need. And so it really all does come back to the question of cost, right? And that's where having really great public universities that are, relatively speaking, in terms of the value of the dollar in 2024 and not in 1954, still affordable for most people, is so critical. And that's why I write in the book a lot about the importance of supporting our public system of higher education, because You can have excellence and you can have access at one university, but you need to have more funding. Now, again, I think the landscape of jobs being what it is and the kind of changing character of it leads me to believe, and I maybe just sort of fit the facts to suit my own belief system here, because I believed this for a very long time, but I continue to believe that a kind of mix of classes that you would take, a mix of things that would include general education as well as a specific major, is the best thing a student can have. Some acquaintance with, the history of the world, some acquaintance with issues of ethics and what it means to live a good life and what the good society might be like. Some sense of the world outside of a particular career path could actually be good for you both as an individual, as a member of society, and ultimately as somebody who might be making decisions about the future of our economy and the future of careers in that economy. But I think it has to be a mix. And so one of the things I did at Berkeley was to create a data science curriculum that was a curriculum across the university, so that it wasn't just for CS, it wasn't just for computer science students. It was for anyone. You could take a course in public health, you could take a course in biology. I mean, you could major in public health, you could major in biology, you could major in even an undergraduate business program, or for that matter, in English, philosophy, or history, and still learn enough in the world of data analytics, basic coding, but also statistical reasoning, that you probably would be able to talk your way into a job anywhere from, going to graduate school on the one side or getting a job at Google on the other. But it's just so much more difficult if you're carrying lots of debt.
Yeah, I think you also made a good point about when you talked about these Ivy League schools. You could go to Harvard and major in anything and you still have a degree from Harvard, versus majoring in anything at, I don't know, Iowa State or Florida State or whatever. I mean, people are going to look at you significantly different just when it says Harvard versus, I don't know, Colorado or Boulder or something,
Well, Harvard, Harvard's taken a few hits this year, but
yeah, yes, they have.
But that H on your CV still signifies a lot. Yeah, you could go to Harvard and get, they used to talk about in the early 20th century, they talked about the gentleman C people would get, and they would go on, of course, and rule the world. They'd certainly, take the prominent positions in Washington and New York. Harvard graduates still do well, and I think they do well whatever they major in. But absolutely, otherwise you go to a second, third, fourth tier school because you can afford to go, because it's close to home, because you need to look after an aging parent, or whatever the kind of situation that constrains you, or just because of your preference, or because that's your football team. You're still going to get great courses. You're still going to be able to work with great faculty, but it's not going to mean the same thing when you get your sheepskin at the end of 4 years, or whatever the period of time it takes to get the degree.
Right after high school, I went to Brown College in Minneapolis, which is, at the time, I went for radio broadcasting. I wanted to be like a sports announcer, and it's like the preeminent radio broadcasting school. And so, I graduated with an associate's in radio broadcasting, and I would have on my resume, I would have Brown College, and then I'd have, Minnesota. And there's it's amazing, the people that would just hear Brown know it's an Ivy League. Well, of course, they didn't know that it's on the East Coast, was in Providence, Rhode Island, whatever. But it was amazing, the switch people would have when they'd oh my God, you must be a genius. It's first off, even if it was the Ivy League school, it's radio broadcasting, okay? I mean, it's not like I'm going for being a physicist or, quantum mechanics or something like that, right? I mean, but I just thought it was amazing, the shift in there, oh, wow.
Yeah. No, it's, look, I mean, social psychologists and behavioral economists, they will tell you about the halo effect, and the Ivy League confers a halo effect for sure. But you can't disparage radio broadcasting for me, both because you did it and because my daughter studied radio broadcasting, and now she's a reporter for NPR. So it's a great degree.
Yeah, no, it was very educational. Actually, at the time, I actually had a stutter. My nickname was Stuttering Jesse, and I went to different speech classes and stuff, but having to listen to myself on the radio is oh, that's how I sound. I'm why didn't they use this in speech therapy techniques? I got rid of my stutter in 6 months, But I was, so I mean, I definitely, from that standpoint, I have a hard time to ever kind of disparage the degree. But kind of going back to the cost curve, Right now, less than 20% of students graduate in 4 years. I think it's 19% of students graduate in 4 years, and the average is 6 years. And then somewhere around 33% of students also drop out. So that means you're going to have a third of students most likely with student debt. And then the ones that do graduate in 6 years, I mean, you're paying essentially 50%, well, probably more than 50% more just because every year tuition goes up. So those last 2 years are probably more expensive than your first 2 years. When I talk to the advisor, they're like, oh yeah, just take 12 credits. So you want to ease into it. And then later on towards the end, I'm taking 18 college credits, but I was taking 18 towards the end when I had much harder, more challenging classes versus the beginning where it's like you're in 101 there, 101 that. Like it's just really easy classes. I think you should be loading up at the beginning instead of loading up at the end because I was trying to make up for lost time. But I was like, that's awful advice. Looking back on it, I'm like, man, like I should have never listened to that advisor.
Well, academic advisors, they sometimes have a kind of playbook they read from and don't always customize the actual advice to the student. When you're studying either part-time or with the recognition you have to take some time off or you have to work sometimes not just one but more than one job to make ends meet, you have to adjust and you have to figure out how to both be in a situation where you can do the work, get it done, and at the level that it requires, and and pay for it. And that is indeed why it is the case that that so many students do drop out. And the idea of the 4-year residential degree now, which is the one that typically the Berkeleys and the Harvards and whatever, whether they're public or private, they assume that's the model. It's such a minority now, as you were just saying. So it really is a different picture. And I think what we're facing now is a number of different issues. First, how do you get people who have not gotten a degree, have not finished their college degree? How can you get them back? And I talk about this at the end of the book. I mean, how do you get them back to school so they can actually get a degree? Because the worst thing in the world, far worse than just having debt, is having debt without a degree. Because then you're really screwed. So it has to be easier to transfer. It has to be easier to transfer credits. It has to be easier to go part-time. It has to be easier to get the kind of support you need, both financially, but also in terms of sometimes tutorials for, maybe 6 years ago, you took the course that was the prereq for the course you're taking and you have to take to graduate. Well, how are you going to do that? You don't want to take the course over again. But, now we actually have tools that can be helpful. I mean, including AI. I mean, you can have personalized instruction that could provide much more in the way of tutorial support, perhaps, than existed 10 years ago. I've encouraged my colleagues in universities to think a lot about what AI can do for students and not just how it's going to make your life more difficult when it comes to grading papers if you think they've all been produced by ChatGPT. I said, yeah, sure, that's going to happen. Okay, have a writing exercise in class, pull out the old blue book and go back to the old system for that. But remember, this is a huge resource for students, and it could be really helpful if they're engaged in some serious upper class work where they need to have refresher stuff or even just sort of tutorial support that you can't yourself personally provide. But again, you should be able to move credits across universities. And then even once you graduate, you're going to need different kinds of lifetime learning to stay up with what you need to know to get the kinds of jobs you want. And sometimes that is a degree, but it's not always a degree. Sometimes it's very different. It's more like professional development. It's more like, teachers in schools who have to go back and get, take a course here and a course there. They get credit for it, say in the state of New York or the state of California, where I've been. But too few other jobs actually give you credit just for doing a very specific skills-based kind of program that is not about a degree, but it's about a skill and a skill that you can upskill and attain fairly quickly if you get recognized for it and the like. So I think we have to be much more flexible institutionally in the way in which we think about student progress. And we also have to remember that more students than before are what we used to call non-traditional students. And in some sense, the non-traditional student is now the traditional student, which is, they've taken time off or they've gone through different institutions. They're not just going to one college for 4 years. And we have to design pathways that are appropriate for those students who are not benefiting from the old model.
as I mentioned in the email, I wanted to talk about the adjunctification. And I referenced that podcast with Dr. Marian Nessel, and she was mentioning basically, she had tenure, and she was basically mentioning how they had to like buy her out to essentially, I guess you could say, get her to leave. But it's like, name another profession where outside of maybe politics, where you have, politicians, I think the average age is like in the 70s or so, whatever, but like outside of tenured college professors and politicians, name another profession where you have to kick out 80-year-olds. Like, hey, just here's some money, like leave. But then the flip side of that is, because you have this tenured professor that's now 75 teaching 2 classes and making a bunch of money, now you have a bunch of adjunct professors that are making really small money, really have no room for advancement because they're waiting for those tenured professors to basically, to die almost, not even to retire, and like, it just seems like, and then of course you have all the issues where it's like, if a tenured professor, I mean, they obviously can't get away with murder, but they can get away with a lot of things. But I hear comments from people like, oh yeah, like this tenure professor, he was really like, he was harassing students in class and didn't even teach anything. And if you were an adjunct professor, though, they just wouldn't renew your contract the next year, right, if they had issues with you.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And adjuncts not only get paid very, very little, but they are completely, casualized in terms of any kind of employment contract. So it's, it's course to course. And you're right, too, that, that a lot of adjunct or adjunctification in the academic world is the result of tenured faculty staying on in their jobs and staying on, long past perhaps their shelf life. There are faculty who continue to add real value to the university later in life, and and I as a dean, leave alone as a member of faculty, I always believe that there were things that one could do. For example, there are some faculty who have stopped being active researchers, and maybe if you told them they had to teach a lot more, they might make a different decision about whether they were going to retire or not, because you usually set a teaching load in a R1 university on the basis of the fact that they're going to be spending a significant amount of their time doing research as well as teaching. But if they're not doing the research, then maybe they should teach more, and there should be some way you can up the teaching load depending on research output. And again, that might be a kind of gentle way of telling people, maybe it's time to retire. But, the problem is that tenure was devised as a way to effectively encourage people to go into the teaching profession because it was not paid as well as other professional jobs, whether in the law or, in business. And increasingly, of course, academics at top universities get paid very well. And so there really is very little in the way of incentive either to retire or to think about a different structure for hiring faculty that would, for example, bring in more lecturers who would be paid better. Instead of being paid course by course, they would be given more regular contracts, and maybe they didn't have tenure, but they were going to be given certainly a much better salary with full benefits and longer term contracts so that they could actually plan their lives around it. And some universities are doing that. But again, it requires not just administrators to make decisions. It requires faculty, and this is sort of ending where we started. This requires tenured faculty to take responsibility for the privilege they have in universities and be partners with administrators in devising ways that actually do make them more responsible and even accountable, and help deal with these kinds of major structural problems like the rise in the use of adjuncts at very low wages and no security in the universities in which they work and from which they get, very, very substantial resources.
Today's guest has been Nick Dirks, author of the book City of Intellect, The Uses and Abuses of the University. Nick, can you just let people know where they can find your book, that kind of information, and then leave us with a final thought related to the book or just what's on your mind in general?
Well, thank you. Yeah, The City of Intellect is published by Cambridge Press. It's available on Amazon, also directly through the publisher. So, I'd love it if people would read the book and get in touch. I currently work at the New York Academy of Sciences. As you said, one of the things that we're working on at the Academy is trying to deal with the decline in trust in institutions. And the New York Academy in particular, we're talking about science and scientific institutions. But of course, I think about it more broadly in terms of the university. And that's why I wrote the book, in part, was to say, this was my life in the university. I loved my life there, but there were lots of things I learned and lots of things universities can do to be better at earning trust from the public. And the hope is that I can encourage at least a conversation about things that, institutions can do on the one side, but also on the other, bringing the public more into these conversations so that they can make what would be, I think, reasonable demands on institutions, whether they're talking to you about the latest vaccine or the possible virus or climate change or whatever, that we all think really, really hard about the question of trust. Because at the end of the day, we're all going to depend on these institutions to help us cope with future challenges. And if they've completely lost any kind of meaning or authority, and partly have been even responsible for that, but nevertheless are in that position, we're all going to be the worse for it. So thank you so much, Jesse. It's been great to be on your podcast. Thanks for having me.
My dear friends, that is it for this episode of El Podcast. Once again, if you're not yet subscribed, please subscribe on YouTube as well as Rumble. You can also find us on Spotify and Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts from. We thank you all from the bottom of our hearts for watching and listening, and we will see you on the next episode.